Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 21-month-old boy who disappeared from outside a Greek farmhouse one summer afternoon in 1991. A case that would span 3 decades, hundreds of reported sightings, excavations for buried remains, and a mother who never stopped searching. A mystery that remains unsolved. This is the story of Ben Needham, Kos. It's a Greek island in the Aegean Sea, part of the Dodecanese group of islands near the Turkish coast. In 1991, Kos was already a popular tourist destination, known for its beaches, ancient ruins, and warm Mediterranean climate. But it also had quieter areas, rural villages where Greeks lived traditional lives away from the tourist resorts. Ben Needham was born on October 29, 1989, in Sheffield, England. He was the son of Carrie Needham, then 19 years old. Ben's early life was typical of a toddler, filled with the discoveries and developments that come with those first years. In 1991, Carrie's parents, Eddie and Christine Needham, made a decision that would change their family's life forever. They decided to move to Kos. They'd purchased a farmhouse in the village of Iraklis, near Kos town, that needed extensive renovation. The plan was to turn it into a home they could live in, perhaps eventually a property they could rent to tourists. The move offered opportunities, a new life in the Greek sunshine, escape from the cold and rain of northern England, a fresh start. Carrie and Ben went with them. Carrie found work at a local hotel, using her wages to help support the family while her parents worked on renovating the farmhouse. It wasn't easy work, the renovation. The property needed substantial repairs. But Eddie and Christine were determined, and they had help from local workers. By July 1991, the family had been on Kos for several months. Ben was approaching his 2nd birthday. He was a blonde, blue-eyed toddler, energetic and curious as 21-month-old children are. He was beginning to talk, to run, to explore the world around him with the fearlessness of a child who doesn't yet understand danger. The farmhouse in Iraklis was isolated, surrounded by fields and rural land. There were few neighbors nearby. Building materials were scattered around the property. Renovation work was ongoing. It wasn't an ideal environment for a small child, but the family was managing. Wednesday, July 24, 1991, was a hot summer day on Kos. Carrie had to work at the hotel. Eddie and Christine were at the farmhouse, continuing their renovation work. Ben was left in their care, as he often was when Carrie was working. It was supposed to be a normal day. Carrie would work her shift. Eddie and Christine would watch Ben while also working on the house. The toddler would play in the yard, supervised by his grandparents. But that afternoon, in a span of minutes that no one can fully account for, Ben Needham disappeared. The exact timeline of Ben's disappearance has never been completely clear. What is known is that on the afternoon of July 24, 1991, Ben was playing outside the farmhouse while his grandparents were nearby, having lunch and working on renovations. Around 2:30 p.m., Eddie and Christine realized Ben wasn't where they'd last seen him. The farmhouse yard was small, enclosed. A 21-month-old couldn't have gone far. They called for him. They searched the immediate area. Ben was gone. At first, there was confusion more than panic. Perhaps Ben had wandered into the house. Perhaps he was hiding, playing a game. Perhaps Carrie's brother, who was also on Kos, had taken Ben for a ride on his moped without telling anyone. But as minutes became an hour, as the searches became more frantic, as it became clear that Ben hadn't just wandered into another room or wasn't with his uncle, the terrible reality set in. Ben had vanished. The Greek police were called. Officers arrived at the farmhouse and began an immediate search of the surrounding area. The fields, the nearby roads, any place a toddler might have walked to. They found nothing. No sign of Ben. No footprints leading away from the property. No witnesses who'd seen him wandering. Nothing. Carrie was contacted at work and rushed back to the farmhouse. She arrived to find police searching, her parents distraught, and her son simply gone. The hours that followed were a blur of activity and growing dread. More police arrived. Search dogs were brought in. Neighbors were questioned. Had anyone seen anything? Had anyone noticed a vehicle in the area? Had anyone heard a child crying? One piece of information did emerge. Witnesses reported seeing a white Suzuki vehicle parked near the farmhouse around the time Ben disappeared. 3 people had been in the vehicle, a woman in the back seat and 2 men in the front. But the vehicle had left before anyone thought to note the license plate or get a better description of the occupants. Was this significant? Had Ben been taken by someone in that vehicle? By nightfall on July 24, 1991, Ben Needham had been missing for hours. The Greek police were treating it as a possible abduction. A 21-month-old doesn't vanish without a trace unless someone has taken him. In the days immediately following Ben's disappearance, the search intensified. Greek police, aided by British authorities, conducted extensive searches of Kos. The island isn't large, only about 40 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide at its widest point. If Ben was still on Kos, surely he could be found. Search teams combed through fields, forests, and beaches. Divers searched the waters around the island. Helicopters surveyed from above. Every abandoned building, every cave, every location where a child might be hidden or might have wandered was checked. British and Greek media picked up the story. Ben's photo was circulated widely. His distinctive blonde hair and blue eyes made him easily recognizable. Appeals were made for anyone with information to come forward. 2 days after Ben disappeared, on July 26, 1991, witnesses at the local airport reported seeing a child matching Ben's description with a woman. The child appeared to be being taken off the island, but by the time police followed up, the woman and child were gone. If it had been Ben, the opportunity to recover him had been missed. This sighting, unconfirmed and never followed up successfully, would haunt the investigation for years. Had Ben been taken off Kos within 2 days of his disappearance? Was he on the Greek mainland? In Turkey, just a short distance across the Aegean? Somewhere else entirely? Carrie Needham was devastated. Her son had been taken, she was certain of it. And whoever had taken him had moved quickly to get him off the island before police could stop them. The theory that emerged in those early days was that Ben had been abducted for illegal adoption. In the 1990s, child trafficking for adoption existed, particularly in less developed parts of Europe. Greece had seen cases of children being sold to childless couples desperate for a baby. Ben's young age, his blonde hair and blue eyes, his Western European appearance, all made him potentially valuable in such a market. The theory was that someone had been watching the farmhouse, had seen an opportunity when Ben was unsupervised for a few minutes, and had grabbed him. If this theory was correct, Ben might be alive, raised by adoptive parents who may or may not know he'd been stolen. He could be anywhere in Europe or beyond, living under a different name, speaking a different language with no memory of his biological family. But proving this theory was impossible without evidence, without witnesses, without finding Ben himself. In the months and years following Ben's disappearance, over 300 reported sightings came in. Ben, or boys who looked like him, were spotted across Greece, on multiple islands and on the mainland. Some sightings came from Turkey, others from as far away as Germany and even Australia. Each sighting was investigated. Each one raised hopes in the Needham family that this might be Ben, that finally he'd be found. In December 1995, 4 years after Ben disappeared, a private investigator named Stratos Bakurtzis reported finding a blonde boy, about 6 years old, living with a Romani family in a camp near Salonika, Greece. The boy matched Ben's description. His age was right. He claimed he'd been given to the Romani family because his parents didn't want him. Police took the boy into custody and conducted DNA testing. The results were negative. The boy wasn't Ben. He had a birth certificate, a documented history. His father was in prison. The story was sad but legitimate. This pattern repeated throughout the 1990s and 2000s. A sighting would be reported. The family would hope. Investigators would follow up. DNA tests would be conducted. Each time, the result was the same: not Ben. In 1998, a holidaymaker saw a blonde boy playing on a beach in Rhodes. In 1999, a photograph taken in a Turkish village showed a blonde child who resembled age progression images of Ben. In 2003, Carrie traveled to Kos with Ben's uncle to follow up on new leads. Each false lead was emotionally devastating. The hope, the anticipation, the crushing disappointment when yet another DNA test came back negative. Some of the sightings were undoubtedly genuine mistakes. People who saw a blonde child and, having heard of Ben's case, reported it out of a sincere desire to help. Others may have been hoaxes, people seeking attention or money, but they all had to be investigated. The alternative, ignoring a lead that might actually be Ben, was unthinkable. As the years passed, the sightings became less frequent. Ben would have been growing up, changing. He wouldn't look like a toddler anymore. By the early 2000s, he'd be a teenager. By 2010, a young man. If he was still alive, if he'd been raised by someone else, would he even know he'd been taken? Would he have any memory of his first 21 months of life? The Needham family never gave up hope that Ben was alive somewhere. Carrie, now growing older, marked every birthday Ben missed, every Christmas without him. She kept his case in the public eye, giving interviews, maintaining a website dedicated to finding him. Then, in 2012, a new theory emerged that would change the entire direction of the investigation. In October 2012, 21 years after Ben disappeared, South Yorkshire police, who were assisting Greek authorities with the case, received information from a new witness. This witness claimed to know what had really happened to Ben Needham. According to the witness, Ben hadn't been abducted at all. He'd been killed in an accident. On July 24, 1991, building work had been underway at and near the farmhouse in Iroquois. A man named Konstantinos Barkas had been operating a digger, an excavator used for moving earth and rubble. The witness claimed that Barkas had told him that Ben had been accidentally struck and killed by the digger, and that Barkas had then buried the child's body in the rubble he was moving. This theory was shocking and horrifying, but it had a certain terrible logic. It would explain why Ben had vanished so completely. It would explain why no witnesses had seen an abduction. It would explain why the hundreds of sightings had never led anywhere. If Ben had been accidentally killed and his body buried in construction rubble, he might never be found. Building materials from the farmhouse renovation had been scattered, dumped in various locations. Ben's remains could be anywhere. Konstantinos Barkas had died in 2015, before this theory emerged publicly. He couldn't be questioned. He couldn't confirm or deny the allegation. But the witness's information was specific enough that police took it seriously. In October 2012, a joint operation between South Yorkshire Police and Greek authorities began. They would excavate the area around the farmhouse, searching for Ben's remains. The excavation was extensive. Forensic archaeologists, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains. The search focused on areas where rubble from the construction work had been dumped. Carrie Needham, told to prepare for the worst, traveled to Kos to be present during the excavation. After 21 years of believing her son was alive, being raised by someone else, she now had to confront the possibility that he died the day he disappeared. The search lasted weeks. Every piece of rubble was examined. Every area the radar indicated was excavated. The work was painstaking, emotional, watched by media from around the world. One item of particular interest was found: a small yellow dinky toy car, a brand of toy vehicles popular in the early 1990s. Ben had been playing with a toy car the day he disappeared. Could this be it? But no human remains were found. No bones, no clothing, no definitive evidence that Ben had been buried there. In September 2016, police returned to Kos for further excavations. New information had emerged, additional areas that might contain Ben's remains. The yellow dinky car found in 2012 had been tested. There were traces of blood on it. Could the blood be Ben's? DNA testing was conducted, comparing the blood to samples from Ben taken at birth during the routine heel prick test performed on all British newborns. In November 2018, the results came back. The blood on the toy car was not Ben's. This was both disappointing and confusing. The car had been found in an area connected to the construction site. It was the right type of toy, but the blood wasn't Ben's. Detective Inspector John Cousins, leading the British investigation, made a statement that received significant media attention. Despite not finding remains, he believed Ben had died in an accident near the farmhouse. The recovery of the toy car, its location, and the circumstances all pointed toward this conclusion in his professional opinion. But professional opinion isn't the same as proof. Without remains, without definitive evidence, Ben's disappearance remained officially unsolved. Carrie Needham refused to accept that her son was dead. She continued to believe he was alive, raised by someone else, perhaps unaware of his true identity. She pointed to the lack of remains as evidence that Ben hadn't died in an accident. The investigation continued at a lower intensity. Periodically, new leads emerged. In 2021, witness reports claimed an English-speaking child around Ben's age had been found about 600 miles from Kos around the time of his disappearance, taken in and raised by the woman who found him. In 2024, a Danish man came forward claiming to be Ben Needham. He said his grandparents had told him he'd been taken from Kos. He described memories of being hidden, of hearing someone shout "Ben" at him at a market years ago. DNA testing was arranged. Carrie Needham, now 51 years old, prepared once again for results that might finally answer the question of what happened to her son. But as of now, those results have not been made public. The pattern has repeated so many times before. A potential lead, DNA testing, negative results. Today, more than 33 years after Ben Needham disappeared, his case remains unsolved. He has never been found, alive or dead. No one has ever been arrested in connection with his disappearance. The truth of what happened on July 24, 1991, remains unknown. Several theories persist. The accident theory, supported by some investigators, suggests Ben was killed by the digger and his remains were scattered or buried in construction rubble. The lack of found remains doesn't disprove this theory. It simply means the remains haven't been located. The abduction theory, which Carrie Needham maintains, suggests Ben was taken for illegal adoption. If this is true, Ben could be alive today, 35 years old, possibly unaware of his true identity or vaguely aware that something about his childhood doesn't add up. Some investigators believe witnesses on Kos know more than they've said. The witness who claimed Barkas admitted to the accident has refused to speak to police again. Others connected to the construction site have been less than forthcoming. Cultural differences, language barriers, and the passage of time have all made it difficult to get complete cooperation. Carrie Needham has pleaded with authorities to return to Kos, to re-interview witnesses who lied or refused to talk properly, to speak with police officers involved in the original investigation. She believes answers exist on that island, that someone knows what really happened to Ben. The case has drawn comparisons to other missing child cases, particularly that of Madeleine McCann, who disappeared from Portugal in 2007. Both cases involved British toddlers vanishing while on holiday in southern Europe. Both generated massive media attention. Both remain unsolved. But Ben's case predated Madeleine's by 16 years, and the response to it was different. Technology was less advanced in 1991. Media coverage was less intense. The investigative resources available were more limited. Some have suggested that if Ben had disappeared in 2007 rather than 1991, the outcome might have been different. More immediate response, better forensic capabilities, greater international coordination. But speculation about what might have been doesn't help find Ben or answer what happened to him. Ben Needham would be 35 years old today if he's still alive. He'd be a grown man, perhaps with a family of his own, with a career and a life. Or he died at 21 months old, his life ended by accident or violence, his remains lost somewhere on or near Kos. Carrie Needham is now in her 50s. She spent more than 3 decades searching for her son, keeping his case alive, refusing to give up hope. She's endured hundreds of false leads, multiple excavations, countless disappointments. She's been told to prepare for the worst, told her son is dead, told to accept that he'll never be found. But she continues to believe Ben is out there somewhere. That someday, someone will come forward with credible information. That the right DNA match will finally be made. That after 33 years, she'll be reunited with her son. The investigation remains open. South Yorkshire police continue to review leads as they emerge. Greek authorities maintain their files on the case. Ben's photo, age progressed to show what he might look like today, is still circulated. If Ben Needham was abducted and raised by someone else, he would now be old enough to research his own origins. If he's ever felt that something doesn't add up about his childhood, if he's wondered about gaps in his early memories, if family stories have never quite made sense, that curiosity might lead him to search. DNA testing is simple now. If Ben is alive and submits his DNA to any genealogy database, it could match with family members. The technology that has solved other cold cases could solve his. If you have any information about Ben Needham's disappearance, you can contact South Yorkshire Police or Missing People UK. Even after 33 years, information could be crucial. Ben's family deserves answers. Carrie deserves to know what happened to her son. Ben deserves to be found, whether that means finding him alive or finally locating his remains so he can be properly laid to rest. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Ben's story. Keep his case alive. Keep the pressure on for answers. Thank you for listening tonight, and for remembering Ben Needham, the toddler who disappeared from a Greek farmhouse and has never been found. Story 2. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a 16-year-old girl who walked through an alleyway on her way to a friend's house one January evening in 1993 and was brutally murdered, a case that would remain unsolved for 21 years. A killer who attended his victim's funeral, and a group of school friends who never gave up fighting for justice. This is the story of Claire Tiltman, Greenhithe, Kent, England. It's a small town on the south bank of the River Thames, about 20 miles east of London. In 1993, Greenhithe was a quiet, working-class community where families had lived for generations. The kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where children could walk to friends' houses without their parents worrying. Claire Tiltman was born on January 14, 1977. She was the only child of Cliff and Linda Tiltman, a loving couple who doted on their daughter. They lived in Woodward Terrace in the Horns Cross area of Stone, just outside Greenhithe. Claire attended Dartford Grammar School for Girls, a well-regarded selective school where bright students worked toward their GCSEs and A-levels. At 16, Claire was in Year 11, preparing for her GCSE exams that summer. She was a good student, popular with her classmates who affectionately called her Tilts. Claire had dreams. She wanted to become a firefighter. She was working toward her Bronze Duke of Edinburgh award at Dartford Fire Station, participating in activities that would help her develop the skills and character needed for emergency services work. Her parents supported her ambitions completely. Those who knew Claire described her as beautiful, loyal, with a wicked sense of humor. She was the kind of friend people treasured, someone who was there when you needed her, who made you laugh, who made school and life more bearable. On January 14, 1993, Claire celebrated her 16th birthday. It should have been a milestone, the beginning of an exciting year. GCSEs, college applications, the transition from childhood to young adulthood. Claire had her whole life stretching out before her. For days later, that life would end in the most brutal way imaginable. Monday, January 18, 1993, was a cold winter evening in Kent. Claire had been at school during the day, attending classes, spending time with friends. Around 6 p.m., She left her home on Woodward Terrace to walk to a friend's house in Riverview Road, Greenhithe. It was less than a mile, a walk Claire had made many times before. The route took her along the A226 London Road, a main road through the area. She decided to make a detour to buy cigarettes from a shop off Knockhall Chase before continuing to her friend's house. As she walked back along London Road around 6:20 p.m., Claire took a shortcut through a small alleyway near Ivy Bower Surgery. It was dark. The alley was unlit, but it was a route locals used regularly. There was no reason to think it was dangerous. Someone was waiting in that alley. What happened in that alleyway took less than a minute. Claire Tiltman was attacked from behind by someone who struck with savage, frenzied violence. She was stabbed 9 times. The wounds were deep, some measuring up to 15 centimeters, penetrating her chest, back, and neck. The pathologist would later describe the attack as frenzied and remorseless, carried out with clear intention to kill. Claire's clothing showed even more slashes than the wounds on her body, indicating the attacker had struck repeatedly, wildly, without mercy. Many of the wounds were on the right side of Claire's body. The killer was left-handed. Despite her terrible injuries, Claire managed to stagger out of the alleyway onto London Road. A nurse who was passing stopped immediately to help. Others gathered. Someone called for an ambulance, but Claire had lost too much blood. Despite attempts to resuscitate her, she collapsed on the pavement and died at the scene. She was just 16 years old. For days past her birthday, her whole life ahead of her. The murder shocked Greenhithe and the wider Kent community. This wasn't gang violence. This wasn't a domestic dispute gone wrong. This was a senseless, motiveless killing of a schoolgirl walking to see a friend. Kent police launched Operation Artist, one of the largest murder investigations the force had ever undertaken. Detectives combed the area, searching for the murder weapon, for witnesses, for any evidence that might identify the killer. They issued public appeals. Claire's photo appeared on the front pages of local and national newspapers. A reward of £1,000 was offered for information leading to the killer's identification. Officers took over 1,500 statements from residents, from people who'd been in the area that evening, from anyone who might have seen something. The investigation was thorough, exhaustive, consuming thousands of police hours. But despite all the effort, no arrest was made. The murder weapon was never found. No witnesses had seen the attack itself or seen anyone fleeing the scene. One person who contacted police the day after Claire's murder would prove significant, though investigators didn't realize it at the time. A 24-year-old local man named Colin Ashsmith called the incident room. Ashsmith said he'd been driving through Greenhithe on the evening of January 18th. He'd seen someone with curly hair using a zebra crossing near where Claire was attacked. He thought this information might be helpful to the investigation. Police interviewed Ashsmith. He seemed cooperative. He claimed his mother, Diane, a local counselor, had been with him in the car. He said they'd been delivering political leaflets and had driven home, arriving by 6 p.m., before Claire was even attacked. His alibi seemed solid. Ashsmith was noted as a witness and nothing more. As 1993 became 1994, and 1994 became 1995, Claire Tiltman's murder remained unsolved. Detectives continued to work the case, but without new leads, without new evidence, the investigation lost momentum. For Cliff and Linda Tiltman, the grief was compounded by the lack of justice. Their only child had been brutally murdered, and her killer was walking free somewhere, unpunished, possibly even still living in the area. They kept Claire's case in the public eye as much as they could. They gave interviews on anniversaries of her death. They maintained hope that someday, somehow, the killer would be identified. But as the years passed, that hope diminished. Cold cases, particularly murders without physical evidence linking a specific suspect, are notoriously difficult to solve. Witnesses' memories fade. People move away. Evidence degrades. What Cliff and Linda didn't know, what no one knew at the time, was that Claire's killer had struck before and would strike again. In December 1988, 5 years before Claire's murder, a 27-year-old woman had been waiting for a bus in Swanscombe, near Greenhithe. A man forced her into his car at knife point and gunpoint, drove her to a quarry, attempted to rape her repeatedly, strangled her until she lost consciousness, and stabbed her 5 times in the back. Miraculously, the woman survived. She rolled down the quarry and alerted nearby workmen. Her attacker fled. The next day, someone called police with information that only the attacker would know. The caller claimed to be passing through the area, not a local man. It was a diversionary tactic, an attempt to throw police off the scent. The 1988 attack remained unsolved. The victim survived, but her attacker was never identified. In October 1995, 2 years after Claire's murder, a 21-year-old healthcare assistant named Charlotte Barnard was walking home from an evening with friends in Greenhill. She was dragged from the street by an attacker who stabbed her 14 times and left her for dead. Charlotte survived, but barely. The attack happened less than 400 meters from where Claire had been killed. This time, the attacker was caught. Hours after the assault, police arrested Colin Ashsmith, the same man who'd called police about seeing someone on a zebra crossing the night Claire was murdered. When police searched Ashsmith's white Ford Capri, they found half of a school tie. The other half was at the quarry where the 1988 victim had been attacked. It had been used to restrain her during the assault. Colin Ashsmith was responsible for both the 1988 and 1995 attacks. In December 1996, he pleaded guilty to both charges and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Investigators immediately recognized the similarities between Ashsmith's confirmed attacks and Claire Tiltman's murder. All 3 involved knife attacks on women in the Greenhithe and Swanscombe area. All were savage, frenzied. All demonstrated a hatred of women and a desire for control through violence. But Ashsmith denied any involvement in Claire's murder. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, without witnesses, prosecutors couldn't charge him. Ashsmith went to prison for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. Claire's case remained officially unsolved. As the years passed, Claire's school friends grew up. They went to university, started careers, got married, had children. But they never forgot their friend Tilts. They never forgot the empty chair in their classroom. They never forgot the grief that had consumed their teenage years. They never forgot that Claire's killer had never been brought to justice. In 2010, the Kent Police Cold Case Unit received home office funding to re-examine old cases using modern forensic techniques. Claire's case was among those selected for review. In April 2012, on the 19th anniversary of Claire's death, her father Cliff made a public appeal for information. He and Linda had never given up hope that someday Claire's killer would be identified. Tragically, Cliff Tiltman died later that year without ever seeing justice for his daughter. His death galvanized Claire's friends. 6 women who'd been close to Claire at school, including Lisa Gribben and Joan Roberts, launched the Justice for Claire campaign in 2012. They created a website. They organized vigils and memorial events. They contacted media outlets, keeping Claire's case in the public consciousness. They lobbied Kent police to continue investigating. In January 2013, on the 20th anniversary of Claire's murder, the Friends organized a candlelit walk. They retraced Claire's last steps from her home to the alleyway where she died, then held a service at St. Mary's Church in Greenhill. Hundreds of people attended, holding candles and torches, walking in solidarity with Claire's memory. The event generated significant media coverage and brought renewed attention to the unsolved case. The Friends attended meetings with police. They pushed for answers. They refused to let Claire be forgotten or her case be abandoned. Their persistence mattered. Their refusal to give up kept pressure on investigators to pursue every possible lead, to use every available forensic technique, to never stop looking for evidence that could identify Claire's killer. And in 2013, that evidence finally emerged. While serving his life sentence for the 1988 and 1995 attacks, Colin Ashsmith befriended a fellow prisoner named Stephen Dubois. Prison friendships often form out of necessity, out of shared circumstances, out of the need for human connection even in the most dehumanizing environments. At some point during their friendship, Ashsmith told Dubois about an attack he'd committed. He described seeing a girl crossing a zebra crossing, following her, attacking her. He mentioned the zebra crossing specifically, a detail that would prove crucial. Du Bois initially thought Ashsmith was referring to one of the crimes he'd already been convicted of. But later, Du Bois realized something important. There were no zebra crossings in the areas where the 1988 or 1995 attacks had occurred. But there was a zebra crossing near where Claire Tiltman had been murdered. Du Bois contacted authorities with this information. Detectives from the Kent Police Cold Case Unit reviewed Ashsmith's original statement from 1993, the one where he'd claimed to see someone with curly hair on a zebra crossing the night Claire was killed. The pieces fell into place. Ashsmith hadn't been describing someone he'd seen. He'd been describing Claire herself. He'd inserted himself into the investigation under the guise of being a helpful witness, creating a false alibi while providing information only the killer would know. His mother's alibi, claiming they'd been together delivering leaflets and were home by 6 p.m., was investigated. It appeared to be false. Diane Ashsmith, a borough councilor at the time, had allegedly used her position to quiz detectives about the Tiltman case, particularly about a car seen in the area that matched her son's white Ford Capri. In September 2013, police searched Ashsmith's former family home in Myrtle Place, Stone. His father, Aubrey, still living there, protested the search, insisting his son was innocent. But the evidence was mounting. In addition to the prison confession, investigators had compiled a damning case based on circumstantial evidence and Ashsmith's demonstrated pattern of violence against women. In 2014, Colin Ashsmith was charged with the murder of Claire Tiltman. 21 years after her death, he would finally stand trial. The trial of Colin Ashsmith for Claire Tiltman's murder began at Inner London Crown Court in the autumn of 2014. It would last 5 weeks, with testimony from witnesses, experts, and Ashsmith himself. The prosecution, led by Brian Altman QC, presented a case built on circumstantial evidence, pattern of behavior, and Ashsmith's own incriminating statements. Ashsmith had a documented history of attacking women with knives in the same geographic area where Claire was killed. The 1988 and 1995 attacks demonstrated his capacity for extreme violence, his targeting of lone women, his use of knives in frenzied attacks. His phone call to police the day after Claire's murder was highly suspicious. Why would someone call to report seeing a person on a zebra crossing unless they feared they themselves or their distinctive car had been spotted? His false alibi, provided by his mother, suggested consciousness of guilt. If he'd been innocent, why lie about his whereabouts? The prison confession to Du Bois about the zebra crossing attack was compelling. It was a detail that fit only Claire's case, not the crimes Ashsmith had been convicted of. Perhaps most damning was Ashsmith's own testimony. Taking the stand in his own defense, he described himself as an animal. He admitted to having a collection of 20 to 30 knives, to being fascinated by them, to feeling safe, comfortable, and powerful with them. He'd written assault plans. He'd stalked women. He'd broken into a woman's home with a knife, intending to sexually assault her. He'd slashed her nightdress when he realized she wasn't home alone, acting out of frustration and anger. He'd once written that he would kill a schoolgirl because he claimed it sounded impressive. Ashsmith denied murdering Claire, but his testimony painted a picture of a man who hated and feared women, who sought control through violence, who was capable of exactly the kind of senseless, brutal murder that had taken Claire's life. The defense argued that without physical evidence, without forensic proof linking Ashsmith to Claire's murder, the case was based on suspicion and circumstantial evidence. They pointed out that advances in DNA testing hadn't found Ashsmith's DNA at the scene or on Claire's clothing, but the prosecution countered that the absence of DNA wasn't proof of innocence. In 1993, forensic techniques were less sophisticated. Evidence degraded over time. The killer could have avoided leaving biological evidence. On December 11, 2014, after deliberating for just 3.5 hours, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty. Colin Ashsmith, 46 years old, was convicted of the murder of Claire Tiltman. The following day, December 12, 2014, Colin Ashsmith was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years before he could be considered for parole. Mr. Justice Sweeney, passing sentence, said, "You not only ended Claire's young life, which was so full of promise, but also caused unbearable grief and upset to her family and friends." The judge noted that if the murder had been committed after 2003, when sentencing laws changed, Ash Smith would have received a minimum term of 30 years. He also noted that Ash Smith's previous convictions were aggravating factors, and there were no mitigating circumstances. Ash Smith showed no emotion when the verdict was announced. He refused to return to the dock to hear victim impact statements, demonstrating the same lack of remorse he'd shown throughout. Tragically, neither Cliff nor Linda Tiltman lived to see their daughter's killer brought to justice. Cliff had died in 2012. Linda had passed away before the trial began. They'd spent 21 years without answers, without justice, without closure. But Claire's friends were there. The women who'd launched the Justice for Claire campaign attended every day of the trial. They sat in the courtroom, some holding Claire's photo, representing the family that couldn't be there, ensuring Claire was remembered and honored. In their victim impact statements read to the court, family members and friends described the devastation Claire's murder had caused. Lisa Gribben wrote of her beautiful and loyal best friend with a wicked sense of humor. She described returning to school after Claire's death and staring at her empty chair, devastated by the loss. Roger Tiltman, Claire's uncle, noted the sadness that Cliff and Linda couldn't be there to see justice finally done. In December 2015, Ash Smith appealed his conviction. 3 of the country's top judges rejected his appeal. He would remain in prison, serving his sentence for Claire's murder on top of the life sentences he was already serving for the 1988 and 1995 attacks. The community of Greenhithe found ways to honor Claire's memory. In April 2016, Dartford Borough Council approved the renaming of Fast Track Manor Way to Tiltman Avenue. A new community facility in Stone was named the Claire Tiltman Center. These gestures ensured that Claire would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a beloved member of the community whose life had value and meaning. Claire Tiltman was 16 years old when Colin Ash Smith murdered her in a dark alleyway in Greenhithe. She'd been on her way to see a friend. She'd been doing nothing wrong, taking a shortcut she'd taken many times before, living her ordinary teenage life. She never got to take her GCSE exams, never got to go to college, never achieved her dream of becoming a firefighter, never fell in love, got married, had children. All the experiences that should have filled her adult years were stolen from her in less than a minute of senseless violence. Colin Ash Smith is now 78 years old, imprisoned for life, likely to die in custody. He was right when he described himself as an animal. His crimes against Claire and his other victims demonstrated a capacity for cruelty and violence that marks him as someone who should never be free again. But this story isn't ultimately about him. It's about Claire, the girl called Tilts who was loved by her family and friends. It's about the parents who never gave up seeking justice for their daughter. It's about the friends who refused to let Claire be forgotten, who campaigned tirelessly, who attended every day of the trial, who ensured Claire's memory lived on. Their persistence mattered. Their refusal to let the case go cold kept pressure on investigators. Their campaign helped bring national attention to a case that might otherwise have been filed away and forgotten. Justice delayed is not justice denied, though it came too late for Cliff and Linda Tiltman to see. But their daughter's killer was eventually identified, convicted, and imprisoned. The man who attended Claire's funeral, who'd tried to inject himself into the investigation, who'd hidden behind a false alibi for 21 years, was finally exposed and punished. Claire Tiltman deserved better than she got. She deserved to live, to grow up, to achieve her dreams. Since that was stolen from her, she at least deserved justice. 21 years late, but justice nonetheless. If this story has moved you, please remember to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share Claire's story. Remember the power of persistence, of friendship, of never giving up on justice. Thank you for listening tonight and for remembering Claire Tiltman. Tilts, the girl who dreamed of being a firefighter and whose friends never stopped fighting for her. Story 3. Before we begin tonight, I want you to take a moment. Look at where you are right now. Notice what time it is. Leave me a comment below telling me your location and the time there. And if you're settling in to hear this story with me, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps others discover these cases that deserve to be told. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a woman found shot dead in her car beside a golf course in Perth, Western Australia. She was dressed in an elaborate ball gown and expensive jewelry. She was murdered 2 days before a tax hearing where she threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels, a case that would implicate police, politicians, and organized crime, a mystery that remains officially unsolved nearly 50 years later. This is the story of Shirley Finn. Monday morning, June 23, 1975, Royal Perth Golf Club, South Perth, Western Australia. At approximately 8:30 a.m., a motorcycle traffic officer was patrolling along Melville Parade, the access road that ran alongside the golf course. The road was separated from the Kwinana Freeway by only a waist-high fence. From the freeway, the golf course was clearly visible to passing motorists. The officer noticed a white Dodge Phoenix sedan parked on the verge near the 9th fairway. It was an unusual location for a car to be parked. He approached to investigate. Inside the car, slumped over the steering wheel, was the body of a woman. She'd been shot 4 times in the head at close range. The wounds were consistent with an execution-style killing, what criminals called a bowling ball murder because of the pattern the bullets made in the skull. The woman was dressed in a stunning ball gown, expensive and elaborate. She wore diamond jewelry, rings, bracelets, a necklace. None of it had been taken. This clearly wasn't a robbery. The victim was identified as Shirley June Finn. She was 33 years old, a mother of 3, and one of Perth's most prominent and controversial figures. Shirley Finn wasn't just any woman. She was a brothel madam, nightclub operator, and socialite who moved in circles that included politicians, police officers, businessmen, and criminals. In 1975 Perth, where prostitution operated under an unofficial containment system controlled by corrupt police, Shirley was one of only a few madams given the green light to operate. Born Shirley Shearing on November 2, 1941, she'd grown up in middle-class Perth. Her father was a bomber pilot during World War II, but Shirley's life took a different path than her parents might have hoped. Sexually active by 14, she was sent to a Catholic church welfare home, a cruel institution where girls deemed wayward were confined. She ran away at 15, worked in a fashion shop, married young to an Air Force mechanic, and moved to Melbourne. But married life didn't suit Shirley's ambitions. She returned to Perth after her husband became disabled from an injury. In the late 1960s, Perth was experiencing a mining boom. Money flooded the city. Men outnumbered women. The demand for prostitution services was enormous. Shirley met Sydney Madame Dory Flatman, who introduced her to the profitable world of organized vice. By 1969, Shirley was operating her own brothel with protection from Bernie Johnson, head of Perth's vice squad. The arrangement was simple. She paid franchise fees up the chain to corrupt police and politicians, and in return, police closed down any competition. The profits were enormous. Shirley lived well. She drove expensive cars. She wore designer gowns and jewelry. She hosted parties attended by Perth's elite. She was photographed at social events. She operated the Pussycat Club on Hay Street and ran body painting exhibitions at the Royal Perth Show. But beneath the glamour was a darker reality. Shirley knew things. She knew who was taking bribes. She knew how the system worked. She knew names. And in June 1975, she was about to expose them. In 1975, the Australian Taxation Office was investigating Shirley Finn's financial affairs. The tax assessment was substantial, and Shirley was fighting it. She claimed the assessment didn't account for the franchise fees she'd been paying to police and politicians for protection. A hearing was scheduled for June 25, 1975, 2 days after her body was found. In conversations with tax officials in the weeks before her death, Shirley had been explicit about the danger she faced. She told them that revealing the names of those she'd been bribing would put her life in physical danger. She claimed that $73,000 held in a Hong Kong trust fund in her name wasn't actually hers, but belonged to someone else, someone powerful. The tax officials pressed her to reveal names, to provide documentation, to explain the source of her income and the destination of her payments. Shirley resisted, knowing that cooperation with authorities could be fatal. She'd also been having problems with her arrangement with police. Bernie Johnson, the vice squad chief who'd initially brought her into the containment system, was reportedly demanding more money. The mining boom was slowing. Profits were declining, but the payments to police and politicians remained constant. Shirley was squeezed between the tax office demanding disclosure and the corrupt officials demanding silence. She was a woman who knew too much, operating in a world where knowledge was dangerous. On the evening of Sunday, June 22, 1975, Shirley was at home in South Perth with her children. She was seen alive outside her house at approximately 9:40 p.m. She was dressed in her ball gown and jewelry, apparently preparing to go out. Where she went that evening remains a mystery, but multiple witnesses would later claim she was seen at the Old East Perth police station, in the police canteen bar, drinking with detectives. One witness, a university security guard named Burns, reported seeing Shirley's distinctive Dodge Phoenix sedan at the University of Western Australia campus after midnight. The driver appeared to be retrieving something from a building site. Other witnesses reported seeing the car at various locations throughout the night. The timeline was confused, contradictory, deliberately obscured. What is certain is that sometime late on June 22nd or in the early hours of June 23, 1975, Shirley Finn was shot 4 times in the head with a sawn-off .22 caliber weapon. Her body was then driven to the Royal Perth Golf Club and left on display beside one of the busiest freeways in Perth. The location was deliberate, visible from the freeway, impossible to miss. Shirley's body was meant to be found, meant to send a message. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who threaten to talk. The investigation into Shirley Finn's murder was compromised from the start. The very police force tasked with solving the crime was implicated in it. Bernie Johnson, head of the vice squad and the man who'd brought Shirley into the containment system, was an immediate person of interest. But Johnson was a powerful figure within the Western Australia police force. He had connections, allies, the ability to influence how the investigation proceeded. Within days of the murder, strange things began happening. A page was ripped from the visitor's book at the East Perth police station, the page that would have recorded who was in the police canteen the night Shirley was killed. Witnesses who reported seeing Shirley at the station that night were ignored, or their statements were excluded from official reports. The crime scene itself was mishandled. The official police map of where Shirley's car was found was grossly inaccurate, placing it over 100 meters from the actual location. This error, whether deliberate or incompetent, caused witness testimony to be discounted as unreliable when it didn't match the incorrect map. Evidence that should have been collected wasn't. Witnesses who should have been interviewed weren't. The investigation seemed designed not to solve the crime, but to ensure it remained unsolved. 9 months after Shirley's murder, the acting head of the CIB forwarded his final report to the coroner. The report concluded there were few immediate prospects for fresh information or new evidence. 1 month later, the Crown Law Department decided the case deserved no further action. The investigation was essentially closed within a year of the murder. Shirley's killer would never be brought to justice, but rumors persisted. Everyone in Perth seemed to know or thought they knew who'd killed Shirley Finn. The name whispered most often was Bernie Johnson. Johnson had motive. Shirley was threatening to expose the corruption he'd built his career on. He had means, access to weapons, knowledge of how to commit and cover up a crime. He had opportunity. Multiple witnesses placed him with Shirley the night she died. But Bernie Johnson was never charged. He was never even officially named as a suspect. He continued working for the Western Australia Police Force, eventually retiring with his pension intact. In 1985, 10 years after Shirley's murder, then Premier Brian Burke mentioned that a very senior police officer had been under investigation for murder, resulting in that officer's retirement. Burke believed the murder in question was Shirley's, but no formal charges were ever brought. Over the decades following Shirley's murder, witnesses periodically came forward with information. But their testimony was often accompanied by fear, by reluctance to speak fully, by concern about their own safety. Linda Watson, a Perth brothel madam in the 1980s, testified that Bernie Johnson had threatened her, saying she would end up like Shirley Finn if she didn't cooperate. She claimed she'd paid police officers approximately $2,000 per week in protection money. This confirmed what many suspected. The containment system was alive and well after Shirley's death. The corrupt structure she'd been part of hadn't been dismantled by her murder. If anything, her death had reinforced it, proving that those who threatened the system would be eliminated. In the 1990s, a woman named Rosalind Langan came forward with explosive testimony. Langan had been involved romantically with Bernie Johnson. She claimed he'd made what she called a bedtime confession, telling her he'd killed Shirley Finn. According to Langan, Johnson had detailed knowledge of the murder that only the killer would possess. He described the weapon used, the location where Shirley was killed, details about the crime scene that hadn't been made public. But Langan's testimony was complicated. She dated Johnson briefly decades after the murder. Her claims were disputed by Johnson's family and associates. And by the time she came forward, Johnson had developed Alzheimer's disease and was deemed incompetent to testify. Dr. Michael Klauber, who'd known Langan during her relationship with Johnson, corroborated parts of her story. He testified that Langan had mentioned Johnson's involvement in Shirley's murder, that she'd spoken of corruption and dirty dealings, that she'd seemed frightened of Johnson. But others claimed Langan was unreliable, a gossip, someone seeking attention. The truth of her testimony remained contested. Bernie Johnson died in April 2018, taking whatever he knew to his grave. He never testified about Shirley's murder. He never faced charges. If he was the killer, he got away with it. Other names were mentioned over the years. Nettie Smith, a notorious Sydney criminal, was rumored to have flown to Perth for an arranged meeting with Shirley the night she died. Roger Rogerson, a corrupt NSW detective later convicted of murder, was known to have been in Perth around that time. Abe Saffron, one of Australia's most powerful organized crime figures, had connections to Perth's vice scene. Any of these men could have been involved in Shirley's murder, either as the killer or as someone who ordered it. But proving any of it was impossible. Witnesses were afraid. Evidence had been destroyed or mishandled. The police force that should have been investigating was implicated in the crime. For 40 years, Shirley Finn's murder remained officially unsolved but effectively closed. Her children grew up without their mother, carrying the burden of knowing she'd been murdered and that her killer had never been punished. In 2005, on the 30th anniversary of the murder, a cold case review was announced. Journalist Juliette Wills had spent years investigating the case, eventually publishing a book titled Dirty Girl, The State-Sanctioned Murder of Shirley Finn. Her work kept the case in the public consciousness, maintained pressure on authorities to act. In 2017, after decades of campaigning by Shirley's family and supporters, a coronial inquest was finally convened. The inquest would hear evidence, examine witnesses, and attempt to determine what had happened to Shirley Finn. The inquest lasted months, hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses. Former police officers, criminals, prostitutes, business people, anyone who might have knowledge of the murder or the corruption surrounding it. Some witnesses were cooperative. Others were evasive. Some claimed memory loss for events from 40 years earlier. Others refused to testify, claiming fear for their safety even decades after the crime. The inquest heard about the containment system, about the franchise fees paid to police and politicians, about the culture of corruption that had dominated Perth in the 1970s. It heard about Bernie Johnson's relationship with Shirley, about his threats to other prostitutes, about his alleged confession. It heard about the compromised investigation, about the missing page from the visitor's book, about the deliberately inaccurate crime scene map, about witness statements that were ignored or excluded. The picture that emerged was damning. Shirley Finn had been murdered, almost certainly because she'd threatened to expose corruption. The investigation had been sabotaged, almost certainly by police officers protecting themselves or their colleagues. Justice had been denied, almost certainly because those responsible were too powerful to touch. But could the coroner definitively identify Shirley's killer? Could justice finally be served 42 years after the murder? The answer was no. The coroner's findings, released in 2019, confirmed what most suspected but couldn't prove. Shirley had been murdered in an execution-style killing. The investigation had been inadequate and potentially corrupt. Multiple people likely had knowledge of the crime but had never been properly investigated. But without physical evidence, without living witnesses willing to testify clearly, without the ability to charge the dead, the coroner couldn't name a killer. The findings acknowledged that Bernie Johnson was a person of interest but stopped short of accusing him directly. The case was referred back to the Western Australia Police Force Cold Case Homicide Squad for further investigation. But after 47 years, with the main suspect dead and witnesses aging or deceased, the chances of solving the case were minimal. While the inquest didn't bring charges against anyone for Shirley's murder, it did expose the extent of corruption in 1970s Perth. The containment system was real. Police had been taking bribes. Politicians had been protected. The vice industry had been run as a controlled monopoly for the benefit of those at the top. Ray O'Connor, who was police minister at the time of Shirley's murder and later became Premier of Western Australia, was mentioned multiple times during the inquest. Witnesses testified that Shirley had a relationship with O'Connor, that she'd been seen with him at social events, that he was among those receiving protection payments. O'Connor had died in 2013, before the inquest. He could never be questioned about his role, if any, in Shirley's murder or in the subsequent cover-up. The Royal Commission into Police Corruption that followed years after Shirley's death had exposed some of the rot, had led to reforms, had resulted in some prosecutions. But it hadn't touched the Shirley Finn case. Those responsible for her murder had escaped justice, protected by the very system they'd corrupted. The inquest revealed that multiple police officers had lied or withheld information during the original investigation. The visitor's book page had been deliberately removed. Witness statements had been altered or excluded. The crime scene had been misrepresented. Whether this was coordinated cover-up by multiple officers or the actions of individuals protecting themselves or colleagues remained unclear. But the pattern was obvious. The investigation had been sabotaged from within. For Shirley's children, particularly her daughter Bridget Shearing, who'd campaigned tirelessly for justice, the inquest provided some validation but no closure. They learned their mother had been murdered because she'd refused to remain silent. They learned the police force that should have protected her had instead been involved in her killing. They learned that justice would never be served. The state of Western Australia has never officially apologized to Shirley's family. No one in authority has acknowledged wrongdoing. The case remains officially unsolved. Today, nearly 50 years after Shirley Finn was murdered, her case remains one of Australia's most infamous unsolved crimes. Her story has been told in books, documentaries, podcasts, and a crime novel inspired by the events. Shirley's murder represents everything wrong with corruption. The abuse of power, the protection of criminals in positions of authority, the denial of justice to victims and their families. The woman found in the ball gown beside the golf course has become a symbol,